So what you see on my screen right now is just a follow-up to conversations we have been having on our Digitizing Divas group about creating motifs. And in particular, what you see on the screen are some of the designs that I have come up with for trying to duplicate an actual hand stitch chain stitch. So I'm just going to back up one little bit and just say, whenever we are trying to duplicate something that we have been doing for centuries by hand and trying to interpret that same kind of concept into an embroidery machine, we really need to just think about and analyze the way that we have created those hand stitches and try to do our very best to duplicate them as a machine work. We are never going to get them to be exactly like something that has been done by hand. And the reason that I say that, some stitches, of course, you may be more successful at than others, but the chain stitch I found to be something that is particularly challenging. What I'm going to bring up on my screen right now are some close-up pictures of some machine embroidery. This design right here is a purchased blouse that I have, actually more of a t-shirt, in which there is some beautiful embroidery done on it. And one of the things that I've done here is I've taken a close-up picture of it and I'm scrolling in just to zoom in on it a little bit, and you're going to see that all of these little parts of the feather have been digitized in a very little tiny stitch. You can't tell that it's a tiny stitch in the video, but when I measure these little oval shapes, they're kind of like a little chain stitch. I hope you agree with me in saying that. These measure about 4 millimeters, so they're pretty small. And if I look closely at this design as I zoom in on it, and if I were to try to picture how in the world somebody digitized this, let's just say that this design is going to be stitching from left to right. Remember, that's how we always digitize a motif, from left to right. I'm going to rotate the picture in the screen here so that we could try to visualize that a little bit better. So picture it. You're going to be stitching from left to the right, so that it can then connect again from left to right onto the next motif, and then on and on and on. So if I were to analyze this chain stitch, I would say if it was going to start right here, I would need to make one pass down, a pass back up, and I've got to get back down to the ending point so that then it can connect to the next stitch. Do you agree? I hope so. So again, this is a little tiny stitch, and I don't want to bulk it up too much with too many stitches in here. So the way that I would interpret this is I would start right here. I would come down the first path. And I'm just saying this bottom part of the oval as an example. It could start at the top one. That would be up to the digitizer to decide what direction you wanted it to stitch in. So this would be my starting point. I would come down one side with a single run. I would come back up this side with a triple run, and then I would come back down again on this side with a single run. And that would be the way that I would be able to get, if you look at this closely, it's starting to get too pixelated here, but you would see that this basically has 2 runs of stitches down one side, and possibly this is a triple run right in through here, because that would be the only way you'd be able to get it to look like this. So it would be stitch, 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 and then it would connect on to the next part of that chain to complete that line of stitching. So I hope that makes some sense to you. What I'm going to switch over to next is a picture of a project that I'm currently working on, in which I am combining some crochet, some handwork, and some machine digitized designs that I have done for this project. So right here on this green stem, this is a real true-to-life chain stitch that's done by hand. So if we look at this chain stitch, and again I'm going to kind of try to zoom in and hope it doesn't get too pixelated. If you know how to chain stitch, you know that your needle is coming up at this point. You're making a loop of thread that your needle then passes underneath the fabric and out at this point, and you tighten up this loop of thread in order to make this link of the chain. Then you just repeat that process over and over. Needle down underneath the fabric as you're creating a loop, and all of these chains just connect one right after another. Very difficult to try to duplicate this on an embroidery machine. Some of the other things that you might just be looking at as I've got this little part of my design opened up big is that right in through here, this stitch right here that I digitized, the pink one is what I am pointing at, was one of my attempts at using my chain stitch that I had duplicated. And I'm not going to be able to get much bigger on that and let you see it closely, but I'll show you the stitch that I used when I get back into my hatch digitizing screen. Okay, so this is what we are talking about, this hand look crochet stitch. A little bit difficult to duplicate. So I've got two different versions of it. The little sharp-ended oval right here that's on my screen is what I tried to copy on the purchased blouse with the feather design on it. And this is my way that I digitized it. If I were to come over onto my right object sequence bar, you're going to see that right here, let's look at this as an outline. You're going to see that this was my single run. The path that came back down around the side was a triple run, and it finished off again with another single run. So that's how that design was created. And when I created it, I also created it so that my reference points were right next to one, right at the ends of the design, one right here and one right here. This design was my effort at trying to duplicate the hand stitch. This was my first chain stitch that I've used, and I've used it on a couple of different projects. One of the things that I just want to make mention of is I brought this in actually as a motif stamp because I did not want to try to duplicate it again in order to make this video. This was my starting point. I don't know if this will show up if I turn on my reshape tool. Yes, it did. But basically the way that I did this one is that I wanted it to stitch back and forth over on itself a couple of different times to make this a pretty strong stitch. Because normally when we are doing hand embroidery, we're using embroidery floss. And embroidery floss comes with 6 strands of thread. And of course the embroiderer can decide how they want to separate those strands and how many they want to use in their hand embroidery. So let's just say, for example, that I separated it into 3 strands. My 6 strands down into 3 strands, which basically would mean that this would be 3 strands of thread sewing over it on top of one another. So to interpret that as a machine embroidery, that means that I could go over each one of these lines about 3 times in order to get it to have somewhat of the same look with embroidery thread. So you could start right here. And again, you have to go from left to right, and you have to go around in a logical, somewhat logical sequence, okay? So you could use straight stitches starting here, straight stitch, straight stitch, straight, straight, second pass, straight, 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 back, third pass, straight, 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 straight. Okay, so now we've got 3 layers of thread all piled up on top of each other on both sides of our motif. So in order to get back down to the ending point, you have a choice. You can either make one side with 4 passes on it and leave the other one with just 3 passes on it, or you could possibly use, like I did up on the oval up here, a combination of single run stitches and triple run stitches. So what does that look like? Let me just zoom in here. One thing I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to delete this. No, I'm not going to delete it. I'll escape. I'm just going to come over here to my player and let you watch these stitch out. So what you're seeing now is this is stitching out as a triple. Did you see how slow that went? It went back as a single. Next design went single, single. All right, and then I let it backtrack on itself there. Oh, here we go. I didn't even realize this was on the screen still. You're seeing an entire line of chain stitches stitching out. And I'm going to have it go really slow for just a few moments. And I'll zoom in and maybe you can see how this is forming. Let's get back to the beginning. Okay, so here it's going to start. This is a single, 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 back up on the bottom side, and now it's going to backtrack on itself in order to get back to the end point. I just like this little doodad in there. I think it gave it a nice look. So to see how that proceeded, it went from a single all the way around, a single all the way around, single all the way around, and then it went back, back. And then I did the little tie-in stitch right here so that it could repeat itself. Okay, so those are just some of the ways that I thought about how to create a chain stitch. You know, just play with it and see what you can come up with. You might come up with something that's a whole lot better than mine. And when you do, I would be interested to hear what you find out. Anybody that wants to try this challenge of creating a hand look chain stitch on their embroidery machine using their digitizing program. So anyway, that's about all I have to say about that for right now. Again, I just want to encourage you that anytime that you want to try to think about a way to create a design on your embroidery machine, you just really have to try to analyze that design, keeping just a couple of things in mind that I didn't mention just a while ago. Make sure that when you have these multiple little lines that you are going to use to create a single motif. Now remember this one here? This has 3 sections to it, and each one of those sections, I actually came into my stitching properties and I turned off the tie-ins and the tie-offs. And the reason that I like to do that is because if you don't, you are going to end up with a little bitty knot in between each one of these little sections, and that really bulks up your embroidery and just doesn't help it to flow smoothly. So remember to turn off the tie-off stitches and also path it, thinking of it as if it's a motif, it has to run from left to the right in order for it to digitize properly. Okay, so this is Fabiola Martinez, and this was just another section about creating chain stitches as motifs in this program that I have open right now, which is my Hatch Embroidery Digitizer version 2. Thanks for watching the video.